Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Tonight we have a discontinued gem fragrance review, and it's from the house of Jean-Charles de Castelbajac. Strong name. It is a house that, if you have been following the channel, I reviewed one of their discontinued scents from the 80s, JCC number 2. This was a vintage Chypre that I absolutely love, adore this fragrance. And it's a house that just recently got back into the fragrance business. And their modern stuff obviously is not going to compete with the vintage stuff, but once I got this, I was like, okay, I need to put this house on my radar, because he is a gentleman who is thought very highly of in the fashion community, so much so that when Mr. Claude Montana passed away recently, just a few months ago, sadly, I did a sort of tribute video to Claude Montana, if you will. It was Jean-Charles de Castelbajac who gave one of the keynote speeches, one of the addresses at the funeral. And so today we're going to talk about a masculine. So the one that I actually reviewed on the channel is a feminine targeted fragrance, but it's a Chypre. I think it's easily worn by men, and reminded me actually with some similarities to Diaghilev. It was beautiful fragrance, very underrated. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to hunt this down. And I found this for a song, and it was a blind buy, and it was a home run blind buy. And sometimes you just have to kind of know your taste and make what I would call educated blind buys. And this was a knock it out of the park blind buy. I have been wearing this for the last probably 6 to 8 months, getting to know it occasionally here and there. You can see I put a pretty good dent in it. And this is called Jean-Charles de Castelbajac. This one is actually from 1982. And it was released in 2 versions. One version is the EDT, which is what I have. The second version is a cologne, eau de cologne concentration, basically, which I've never smelled that one, but I can assume they're probably pretty close. Now, one thing I will say about the distributor, my bottle on the bottom says that it was distributed by Cantaline Inc., which is a fragrance division of Peyote Inc., New York, 10022. And there's a reference number 04736. Now, if you look on Parfumo, it says it was last marketed by Mullins. And I think Mullins was the distributor of this one. Yes, so Mullins was actually the distributor of this one, which I think came out in 87 or so. I'll have to check my notes. 85 to 87, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe even 88, but somewhere in that time frame. Mid to late 80s. So Mullins obviously owned the house in the late 80s. And this is not a Mullins, and so if this was last marketed by Mullins, I'm guessing that this is a original. I have no clue, but I'm guessing this is one of the older versions before Mullins took over. I don't know, but all I know is I am in love with this stuff. So here's the thing about the vintage rabbit hole. When people say that vintage fragrances, that the rabbit hole goes deep, I don't think you can really explain how deep the rabbit hole goes until you really start buying and trying vintage fragrances and kind of catching the vintage bug, if you will, because there are so many fragrances people talk about that from the 80s. Some we're going to talk about on this video. Coros, Santos de Cartier, Antaeus, Oscar de la Renta pour Louis, Caractère, Jules, or Jules is the proper way to say it, from Dior. But I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Derby, and I mean, you could just name fragrance after fragrance, Furio, and just watch some of my vintage fragrance reviews. And you know, you could start making notes. And if you've never tried some of these fragrances, obviously you put them on your wish list. And then you realize that there is just stuff like this out there that hardly anyone talks about. I mean, hardly anyone. I don't think there's a single review of this on YouTube. I may be wrong, I didn't check, but I would be shocked if there's a actual fragrance review of this, because now the fragrance reviewer game is all about reviewing for money. So houses paying them to review. You know, you've got the Middle Eastern houses paying the fragrance reviewers to review their stuff, or they're sending them, you know, the big niche houses are sending them free bottles. Hint, hint. These brands right here are sending out free bottles. I bought all these with my own money. And so, you know, it's turning into kind of a game where stuff like this, people who talk about what they're actually passionate about and what they care about, is dwindling smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'm lucky that I can still do that. I'm not saying I'm the only honest guy in Fragcom or anything like that, but I am saying that I love that I can do these type of reviews for a fragrance that probably would just be pushed to the dustbin of fragrance history, if you will. And I want to shine a spotlight on this. And here's the thing. If you do not understand my kind of love of vintages. Really, the best way that I can kind of describe it, and I'll tell you this, I wore Luciano Pavarotti for my scent of the day just a couple days ago. I think I might have even shown it on a video. And while wearing that, I pulled up his singing of Nessun Dorma. If you've never heard Luciano Pavarotti sing Nessun Dorma, I would highly recommend it. Watch the video on YouTube where you can actually see his facial expressions. And that is maybe one of the most moving 3 minutes, I think, from an artistic standpoint, I've ever witnessed ever on any platform. Sports, you take football, basketball, tennis, baseball, and you add something like opera in, and I'm not even an opera fan is the thing. I just looked it up because of the fragrance, and I've heard it before, but I didn't really, I don't think maybe really pay attention, or maybe it didn't really click with me. I must have listened to that probably 50 times in the last week or so since I wore that fragrance. It is one of the most moving things I think I've ever seen. That's how vintage fragrances feel when I wear them. They just have this kind of moving aspect to them. When I put something like this on, it is a completely, totally, and 100% different feel. Even if you go to Harrods and buy the $800 exclusive Xerjoff or whatever it is, you're not going to ever find something like this, in my opinion. This type of perfumery is dead, extinct. It is gone the way of the dodo, okay? And so for me, this just punches you in the face with quality and passion and time spent and effort and love and honor of the craft of perfumery and all of that stuff, right? And just the beauty and the power of these type of fragrances is bar none. These niche houses cannot compete. They just can't. And with the limitations on these houses now, even if they use the absolute most rose oil that they can use, most oak moss, most this, most that, they'll never get close to a formula like this, in my opinion. This is just something that is of its time, and it really smells like a fragrance from its time. So, like I said, this was released in 1982 and gets almost no love, even amongst the vintage fragrance enthusiasts, if you will. So, here's how I would describe it if you want like the Cliff's Notes version, okay? The opening is a green, aromatic, spicy leather, and it's going to hit you from the very beginning. And if you've smelled some of these fragrances from the past that use a combination of green notes in the top, sharp, bitter green, aromatic artemisias, juniper, basil, probably some other notes in there to add to this greenness. I don't know if I would say galbanum. It doesn't have that resinous feel, but it does have an aldehydic top with bergamot in the top as a lot to go for the citruses, and a base, so a top of the green notes with a base of kind of leathery castoreum, musk, oak moss, frankincense, and leather. And it kind of gives off that combination of sharp, bitter, punch you in the face, old school masculine, but the trick is it's already beginning to lean to the sort of fresher side of what the 80s turned into, because in the beginning, so take someone like Pierre Bourdon. He is a perfect example of his career is almost like a perfect representation of the 80s, because he gave us one of the most animalic fragrances ever released by any niche house or designer in Koros in 81. And then in the late 80s, he gave us Cool Water, which was one of the best-selling aquatic fragrances of all time. So he has one of the best fresh fragrances and one of the most animalic fragrances all in one decade, right? And that's the 80s kind of encapsulated. And it's in this fragrance because what ends up happening is you start to get this sort of Paco Rabanne pour homme, use of dihydromercenol. So dihydromercenol was used in Paco Rabanne pour homme, even going back to 1973, but it was used in a small amount. It wasn't until 82, actually, the same year as the fragrance we're talking about today, that Drakkar Noir came out and just had this overdose of dihydromercenol, and you can really smell this freshness. This was so influential in the 80s. This will get a Vintage Hall of Fame review because of just how influential it was. But actually, for me, I would rather wear this. This speaks more to me than this does, even though I think this was more influential of a fragrance, and it proves by the fact this is still being sold today, which is crazy, that it hasn't been discontinued. But, this is more my taste because it has that green, sharp leather with that animalic castoreum. Castoreum sort of adds this unbelievable warmth to a fragrance. It adds this metallic, slightly dirty, leathery warmth. And in the old days, in the 80s, the old days, it was very common to create that leather accord using a couple different things, but one of them was usually castoreum, right? And so when you take that top of green leather, right, and you take that sort of base that it feels like it's sitting on of this fresher aldehydic soapiness, that basically is the Cliff Notes version of this fragrance. So you have this aldehydic style in castoreum that doesn't feel ultra dirty. It almost feels like you're smelling, I don't know, like vintage castoreum or something. And if you've watched some of my Jill Sanders reviews from the past, you know that I've said Jill Sanders castoreum smells completely different from anything I've ever smelled before. Go watch my Jill Sander Man Pure or Jill Sander Man 2 or, you know, any of those old school Jill Sander fragrances, not even the masculine ones, even the women ones feel very similar in the way that castoreum was used. It just felt singular in its use in vintage perfumery that I've smelled, and I love it. I mean, I would love Jill Sander Man Pure, Jill Sander Man 2 are fragrances that are on my full bottle to buy list for sure. I think they're just amazing fragrances, just impossible to find, and I'm just kind of one of those very patient collectors. Well, with the divorce now, I can't buy anything anyways, but I'm a very patient collector. And so, you know, I'll keep my eyes peeled and eventually something will kind of come up, right? But it definitely has this Jill Sander style leather. If you like those type of fragrances, this is one to put on your perennial to watch list, if you will. And, you know, it has the depth. That's the thing about this fragrance is the depth of this fragrance is unbelievable when you wear it. It goes through so many, not even transitions, because it does transition a bit. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It gets perennially softer as the minutes tick by. You know, it starts off with that old school kind of punch in the face, big. You'll instantly get the comparison to something like Dior Jules, which came out only, like I said, a year or two before, a couple years before, 1980. This is 1982, and Dior, of course, being one of the most iconic fashion houses out there, they're paying attention to what big names like Dior are doing. This is it's a fragrance that really kind of proves to me that I really wish that our good friend Jean Martel made more than just a couple masculine fragrances. He did Paco Rabanne Pour Homme, which I just showed, and he did Jules, and that's pretty much it. I mean, there's really not much else that he did, and it's sad because, I mean, he did something else that I'd like to smell called Dimitri Redvolution by Boticchario. I've never heard of that house or that fragrance. He also did a Mila Schoen fragrance for women called Defiled de Mila Schoen from 1990. I would like to smell that because I'm such a fan of Jean Martel's work. But really, these two are the only two that he made. And they were both so influential and revolutionary. And so I'm positive that both Jill Sander and a house like Jean-Charles de Castelbajac was paying very close attention to what Dior was doing at the time, right? And so you have this quality, but you also have this depth and texture. You know, oak moss adds this texture. I've often said in the past that smelling a vintage fragrance with a proper oak moss, you know, it feels like you're literally standing inside of the tree. Not on the outside, looking at the oak moss grow on the outside, but you're literally enclosed in the tree, smelling the tree, smelling the texture. And it's almost like, you know, a hobbit you used oak moss to wallpaper the inside of the tree, their little hovel, and you can just put your hand on it and just feel the texture of the oak moss. That's really what oak moss adds in a vintage fragrance. And so from the start, you're going to get this combination of dirty and clean, okay? And that sort of, you know, that twist, combination of dirty and clean is kind of a favorite of my favorite fragrances. Love contrast. Contrast is kind of the word that I was looking for. Some of the best fragrances of all time really lean into that contrast. And so for me, I think that this kind of borrows a lot from some of the fragrances that were around in the 80s. Of course it did. And, you know, you think about how influential, and back then you have to remember there weren't these niche houses that would come out and they would be out to the market with 30 fragrances in on their debut. You know, it didn't work that way. They would really spend time on a release and release it, and some of those fragrances would be the only fragrance the house would release for years. You know, Chanel famously took like 26 years or something between Chanel for Men or Chanel pour Monsieur and Antaeus. So that kind of marketing, though, is dead today. We don't really get the time and attention to detail. And it's a great example. Koros is a great example of contrast because it has that dirty, pissy civet vibe, and then it has the cleaner, you know, showery musk vibe. So that soapy musks contrasted with the pissy civet is what a fragrance like Koros is known for. But even in the 80s, what's interesting to me is there's this shift that's happening under the surface. So while my favorite fragrances are the dirty fragrances, the Antaeus is very famously my favorite designer masculine fragrance. Like if you said, Ramsey, you've got to wear one fragrance for the rest of your life, I honestly think I could get away with Antaeus, and maybe just give me Antaeus Sport for the summers, and Antaeus for fall and winter, and I very well may be a happy ram. But even in the early 80s, you could start to see this tectonic shift happening in the 1980s. And if you've ever smelled some of these fragrances like Oscar de la Renta Pour Louis, which many people say smells a lot like Antaeus, but I actually think it doesn't. I think it shares soapier, cleaner vibes that Antaeus really doesn't have. It has this freshness underneath, almost kind of ready to bubble up, if you will. And so basically what we have is we have a fragrance that I think they're paying attention to the trends, is what Jean-Charles de Castelbajac is doing. And you have to remember, whenever you smell a fragrance from the past, you're literally smelling, it's almost like smelling a moment in time, because you have to remember, when it's released, they're paying attention to what came before. And the best fragrances also kind of chart what they think is going to come in the future. And so this undertone of freshness and the trend kind of starting to turn to soapier, cleaner. Maybe they didn't know aquatic fragrances were going to be the big thing, but I think they were thinking that the soapy vibes, and you have to remember that this came out the same year as this, so they didn't know this was going to be such a big hit. This is such a big hit in hindsight, but when this came out, Drakkar Noir was just one of many other fragrances that were on the market, and that big dihydromercenol kind of fresh hit, and what Pierre Bourdon called a new kind of freshness. He wanted to create a new kind of freshness because this was almost synonymous with fresh masculine fragrances, right? And so here we kind of have this trend. It's still very early. We haven't seen things like Cool Water or New West by Aramis hit the market yet. And so it's almost like they're trying to kind of walk this line. So when you smell Jean-Charles de Castelbajac, you're smelling what I would consider to be a very beautiful, wearable 1980s fragrances. Some people say, oh, they have a hard time wearing stuff like this because of how bold and aggressive it is. And I'm not that person at all. But I do enjoy sometimes a fragrance that focuses on the wearability aspect. And here, it really feels like they were trying to make what I would consider to be a very wearable vintage masculine fragrance. Because obviously they have that heavy top Dior Jules leather, spicy green, castoreum kind of creeping in. And underneath, they have this combo of freshness built around that old school soapy, fresh, Oscar de la Renta Pour Louis style, soapiness peeking in. If you've ever smelled Jill Sander Man Pure, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But I actually think this has even more leather than Man Pure. I think Man Pure really tried to almost, like, they tried to give you an impression of leather, right? It's almost like a ghost leather note. Like, it's there. Sometimes I feel like I'm smelling leather, but I don't think leather was a big part of the makeup of Man Pure. I think they were focusing even more on the soapy aspects here, whereas here, the leather is a big part of it. And so, in total, even though this borrows little bits and pieces, like, for example, the mid uses this geranium, woody type carnation spiciness in the mid in Jean-Charles de Castelbajac that reminds me of Santos, which came out in 1981, I believe. I should have had these all pulled up and been ready. It's been a while since I've pulled out some of these bottles and did dates, so you'll have to forgive me. But yeah, Santos de Cartier, I think, came out 1 year before this because it came out the same year as Koros. And this was kind of the choice for someone that didn't want to do the animalic Koros or the animalic Antaeus, the Civet Castoreum combination. They wanted to kind of do something else. And this is kind of the spicier, easier to wear, more, I would say more executive, more dressed up, didn't have as much powerful animalic notes in here, but still, Santos is an 80s fragrance through and through. And so this carries kind of bits and pieces of Oscar de la Renta Pour Louis with a little bit of the soapiness, Santos de Cartier with a little bit of the spiciness into the dry down, and it kind of wears a little bit like Santos. Santos doesn't scream. It very famously sits fairly close to the skin. It's not a screamer. It's not one of those that's going to reach out and grab someone from all the way across the room. And so for me, it was all about kind of the time period. So when I targeted this fragrance for purchase, I was looking at the year and I was looking at the house, and I had such a great experience with this when I reviewed it, that I instantly just went out and found. I think I got this for $50, if something like that. I got very, very lucky with it because there's nothing else like that out there. I haven't looked recently, but if you find this, the Eau de Cologne or the Eau de Toilette for a fair price, I would grab it. If you're a vintage lover, grab it with both hands. I can tell you that for me, I get just as much enjoyment wearing something like this, Jean-Charles de Castelbajac, as I do wearing, the heavy hitters, the Koroses, the Antaeus, the Derbies, the Jules, the Santos, the Caractères, all of that. I mean, I get just as much enjoyment wearing this as I do the Furios and all that stuff. And so it's the first 30 minutes is really where the fragrance is most aggressive. And so I applied a spray maybe half an hour ago, so about half an hour ago. And here, I've got a very old dry down, maybe like 12 hours, 13 hours. I can barely smell it. It's really kind of turned into a very, very soft skin scent. But I can still smell it because what it ends up turning into is the oak moss almost just acts like a fixative. And so you can just kind of smell this this soft green kind of oak moss and frankincense into the dry down with this old school 80s musk. But that punch in the face is kind of the first 30 minutes. And then between 30 minutes and an hour, and definitely between 1 to 2 hours, it kind of softens and it becomes more elegant. And so Jean-Charles de Castelbajac becomes more, I love saying that, de Castelbajac, just becomes more and more kind of elegant into the dry down. But what I love about it is you can really pick out the details. So many fragrances of this time period just kind of get all blended together into like a soup, right? And it just kind of is like a smell that hits you. But here, you can, if you really pay attention and really focus, you can pick out the details. You can kind of pick out the vintage sandalwood, which is beautiful, by the way. And it's soft, and it goes with that kind of very softer dry down. The patchouli is a little bit earthy, and green, of course, and it mixes with that combination of green pine needles, which is just stunning. So the pine needles kind of give a nod, if you will, to polo green, but they don't, this smells nothing like polo green. The cedar wood is kind of spicy, old school, and when you mix it with that green carnation, spicy green kind of floral note, which I wish they would bring back in masculine fragrances nowadays, and when you tandem that up with that bitter sort of sharp green, with a lot of personality, Artemisia adds a lot of personality to me. So the Artemisia in the top adds that strength, that bitterness that you expect from an 80s leather scent, right? And then it just turns from bitter 80s punch in the face to smooth and classy. And I love that it kind of just balances that line. And I wish I knew who the perfumer was. I would be very interested who made this. Some people compare it to Roger Engelay L'Homme from 2008, the version from 2008. I've never smelled that. Apparently that's discontinued. The original L'Homme came out in like the late 70s. I've never smelled that either, believe it or not. I've never smelled either L'Homme. But I would like to smell both. But it's the 2008 version that this gets compared to. According to Parfumo, I have no clue. If anyone out there has smelled both of those, I would love to know if that's true or not. But I'll make an outrageous statement here on the quality of the materials of this scent. If you like wearing Patou pour Homme with that soft, beautiful sandalwood oak moss kind of dry down that Patou pour Homme so elegantly has, I get just as much enjoyment out of this as I do Patou pour Homme. Another 80s baby that just gets hyped to high heaven. So $1,000 on Patou pour Homme, $50 on Jean-Charles de Castelbajac, right? And so it's just so well balanced. I mean, I can only say the same things over and over so much, but I mean, it really is one of those amazingly well-balanced frags. If you've smelled some of the Jill Sanders fragrances from the past, it's going to remind you a little bit of the way Jill Sanders used Castoreum with that dirty leather, but also it's almost like you're smelling a vintage Castoreum. Like, the reason I'm saying that is if you smelled Civet de Nuit by Arise Le Doré, and Sultan Pasha was the perfumer of that one. There is this vintage civet that's used in there, and it smells a little. It smells almost completely different from what the actual modern civet, fresh civet, would smell like. And so I say vintage Castoreum because the Castoreum used by Jill Sanders, and this one also, this is the only other fragrance that uses a Castoreum that kind of reminds me of the way Jill Sanders uses it. And you still get the dirtiness, but you also get this unbelievable smoothness, like a enveloping warmth that comes along with it. And it's like leather. You know what it's like? It's like leather kind of being washed in soap with aromatic green notes kind of floating inside of the water you're washing with the soap. So the basil, which is green and tart, and the juniper berries, which add a little bit of that fizzy aromatic side of things. So imagine the leather literally just being dipped in the soapy water and kind of being washed. And that perfectly captures 80s in a decade. This fragrance also perfectly captures the 80s in a decade because it gives you the leathery, sharp animalics with the hint of frankincense, old school musk, and leather in the opening. But it also contrasts that with the late 80s clean, soapy vibe. So this is almost like 80s in a bottle. I mean, it literally is like the decade of the 80s in a bottle. And it's really like a harbinger of things to come, because this and this are two fragrances that I think really start to contribute, of course, especially with Drakkar Noir. You know, they're starting to really signal a change underneath the surface. And, you know, the last thing into the dry down, one thing that you'll notice if you're lucky enough to get to smell this is the texture of the oak moss and how it's so desperately missing from modern perfumery. That's why I said you could spend $800 on a exclusive from one of these big niche houses or whatever it is, but you're not going to get this type of dry down. You know, it really shows. It's like you're smelling something that's missing. Drastically missing when you smell some of these modern scents. And what is drastically missing is the way that the moss is used in the base. And the other thing I will say is, as it kind of dries down, there is this almost like unlisted tobacco note that's in here, like a masculine tobacco that is in the base. It's like a earthy, very fine tobacco, not listed, but very well done. So you get the woodiness, you get the earthiness, you get the spiciness, you get the green leather, you get the soapy kind of fresh part that's beginning to be a harbinger of things to come in the 80s, and just, I mean, deserves to be talked about. In my opinion, this deserves to be talked about. And the bottles, if you go to Parfumo, you'll notice the bottle is even a little bit different from this one. There is a picture of this also. There's a picture of this bottle, but the one they have on the front page has Jean-Charles, and then it's like his signature, J.C. de Castelbajac, like he actually signed it. So maybe when Mullins took over, they also changed the bottle a little bit. I don't know enough about kind of the different versions to speak to that, but it's just something I noticed. So anyways, 30 minutes is kind of where I want to try to keep these videos from now on. So if you have any experience with this, I would love to hear your thoughts. And of course, if you're a vintage 80s lover, this is one to put on the list, if you will. If it's not one that you're familiar with some of these big hitters that we discussed today, the Santos, the Jules, I think this is one that you would really appreciate. So as always, thanks very much for the support, everyone. We're coming up on 8,000 subscribers quicker than I know what to do in the video. So if you have any ideas for, 8,000 subs, leave a comment. Love to hear and get the feedback from everyone as much as I can. We're still small enough where I can respond to every comment for now anyways. So I appreciate everyone who watches and comments and likes and subscribes and all that good stuff. So thanks as always. Cheers, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.